In this lecture, we will discuss an introduction to the heart and heart anatomy. So your cardiovascular system is composed of your heart, your blood vessels, and even the blood within the vessels themselves. Your heart is responsible for pumping the blood either to your lungs or to your body. And then the blood vessels are going to distribute that blood to the lungs or the body, depending on what vessels we're talking about. And in the blood, we're going to transport things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and wastes. So the heart itself is situated in your thoracic cavity, slightly to the left-hand side, just slightly. It is posterior to your sternum, okay, within the mediastinum. Okay, so if we remember, mediastinum is kind of the middle portion of your thoracic cavity area. It includes the heart and the great vessels. It sits on top, or the heart itself sits on top of the diaphragm as well, for another reference point. The apex of your heart is actually the kind of a point, okay, not super pointy, but the point-ish end, okay, which is a little confusing because the base, okay, is actually on the posterior side, it's the back side. So the base is it's not super flat, but it's a little more flattened on the back side of the heart. And again, the apex is the more pointy part. And so students sometimes will get confused because they think base is the bottom. Not this time, sorry. And then the heart itself, it's actually not very big. It's about the size of your fist, and it weighs not even quite a pound usually. So for such an important organ, it's not very large. Now, just because it's not very large doesn't mean it's not super important to protect it. So we wrap this heart in multiple layers. We have pericardial layers to start with. Your pericardium is your serous membrane that surrounds your heart. You have a fibrous pericardium. This is the most superficial layer that surrounds your heart. We have a bunch of collagen bundles, which are tough, and we anchor the heart to the other structures like the diaphragm, and then we hold the great vessels in place as well. We don't get a lot of flexibility here, so low distensibility. So your fibrous pericardium doesn't really change shape or size as the heart beats, okay, which helps prevent the chambers from overfilling with blood. So we're back to that, too much of a good thing is never a good thing. So overfilling the chambers doesn't really do us any good, and it can actually damage the heart. And so the fibrous pericardium helps prevent overstretching. Here we go, serous pericardium. Okay, so our serous membrane, which produces serous fluid. Your serous pericardium is your parietal and your visceral pericardiums. So we had fibrous pericardium. Okay. Now we have parietal and visceral pericardiums. Your parietal pericardium is fused to the surface of the fibrous pericardium. Okay. It basically encases the heart like a sack. Okay. And then it folds over itself and then becomes your visceral pericardium, which touches the heart directly. Sometimes your visceral pericardium will also be referred to as your epicardium. It's the same thing. Okay. Between these two layers, your parietal and your visceral layer, that's where that serous fluid is found, okay, which helps reduce friction. Okay. So sometimes we call it pericardial fluid instead of just serous fluid, just to be more specific. So the pericardial cavity between the parietal and the visceral pericardial layers, that's where this pericardial fluid is going to live. And you can see in our picture here, we've basically got this sac that wraps in on itself. Okay, so the outer wrapping would be the parietal layer, and the inner wrapping that touches the heart would be the visceral layer. Okay. Why are we wrapping? What is the fluid for? We are reducing friction. Okay. The pericardial fluid acts as a lubricant. Your heart beats a lot, literally every moment that you're alive, your heart's beating. And if we did not provide a little bit of lubrication in there, there is the chance that all of the friction would eventually rub a hole in either the membranes or the heart itself. And we don't want any of that. And so that pericardial fluid helps with that. Now, sometimes we end up with too much fluid. So excess fluid, which it doesn't have to be serous fluid. It could be blood, it could be pus, so we could have some kind of wound, we could have some sort of infection. Too much fluid in your pericardial cavity will actually start to compress your heart and limit its ability to pump blood. And we call this cardiac tamponade. Okay, and if that happens, we have to do something about all that fluid, because if we're compressing on our heart, that's not a good thing. We did mention that the visceral pericardium is also referred to as your epicardium, so just kind of be aware of that. Either of those terms is just fine. And then under your epicardium, would be your myocardium, okay, which is your muscle layer, your cardiac muscle layer. And then finally, we would have your endocardium on the inside of the heart itself. So that cardiac tamponade, we said, results from excess fluid of any type in the pericardial sac. We said we're compressing the heart. It's not able to pump as effectively. There's lots of different causes of this. We said trauma, cancer, kidney failure, HIV, all kinds of bad things. Regardless of the cause, we are going to want to drain all that excess fluid. So we put some little needles in there, and we pull all that fluid out to reduce the excess pressure. Some of the typical symptoms of cardiac tamponade include anxiety, restlessness, chest pain, difficulty breathing, so forth and so on. And we just have to drain that fluid so the heart can start pumping normally again. All right, we mentioned the myocardium is where your cardiac muscle lives. Your cardiac muscle is composed of myocytes, cardiac muscle cells themselves, and the surrounding extracellular matrix. These cardiac muscle cells are connected by intercalated discs, which are composed of gap junctions. These gap junctions, the name kind of implies that there are little gaps within these junctions. This allows for the rapid transport of substances through those gaps. What we are trying to do is make sure that your heart beats synchronously. Okay, so your atria need to contract at the same time, and then your ventricles need to contract at the same time. But you've got a ton of myocytes that are having to do the same thing at the same time, so we need to communicate with them very quickly. And so it's easy to do with those gap junctions. Now, your cardiac muscle cells also have a fibrous skeleton that is associated with them. It's full of dense irregular connective tissue. We need to basically kind of hold everybody together, as well as provide structural support and act as an insulator for heart's electrical activity. And so the dense irregular tissue helps your heart beat more efficiently. Last but not least, for the layers, you have that endocardium. This is that deepest layer of the heart. It lines the chambers. It also lines, it's continuous with the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. So it shares a lot of the same functions as the endothelial cells of the blood vessels as well. The endothelium is simple squamous epithelial tissue, and then we've got several layers of connective tissue with elastin and collagen in them as well, because this is the layer that's going to be in contact with the blood itself. So we've got our little list here. If we go superficial to deep, we're going to do our fibrous pericardium. and then your parietal and visceral pericardiums, okay, or your epicardium, whatever term you like, and then your myocardium and your endocardium. Okay. Now, we've kind of talked about the excess fluid in the pericardial cavity, but you could end up with inflammation of your pericardium or your endocardium also. So we call them pericarditis and endocarditis. Both of those can affect how well your heart pumps and how efficient it is. All right, a few more structures about the heart. Externally, we have what we refer to as your atrioventricular sulcus. Sometimes you'll hear it termed your coronary sulcus or your coronary groove. These are all the same thing. This is a little indentation that separates the atria and the ventricles. Okay, so the atria are your top two chambers, your ventricles are your bottom two chambers. And then you have interventricular sulcus as well. This separates the right and left ventricles. Okay, so you have an anterior interventricular sulcus. You also have a posterior interventricular sulcus. So these are kind of long words, kind of big words, but these are little indentations. Okay, so sometimes they're not super apparent on an image or a heart model or something because they're really just slight indentations. Okay. Now internally we also have to separate the chambers, so we have an interventricular septum and an interatrial septum. Okay, these would separate the ventricles and the atria respectively on the inside of the heart. These sulcuses, sulci, these grooves, whatever you want to say, these are external. All right, internally we also have the chambers themselves. Your right and left atria are receiving chambers. Your right and your left ventricles are pumping chambers, so they have more muscle to them. Your atria also have what we refer to as auricles, right and left auricles. The auricles are extensions of the atria. They increase surface area to allow more blood to come into the heart. They're basically located where the atria are themselves, and so on the models, on the images, on the heart specimens, you're going to see us pointing to things that, you know, one time the arrow might be in a certain location and it says, you know, your right atria, and the next time the arrow looks like it's in the exact same place, but now it says it's the right auricle. Okay, so how are you going to distinguish? You're really going to distinguish based on what the question is asking you. Okay, if it's pointing to the, you know, the upper right region and it says what chamber is this, well, that's your right atria. If it's saying what structure is this, then the more correct answer would be your right auricle. Okay, and so try not to get too set on exact placements of arrows and things like that, because some of these structures are basically in the same place. They're really just different terminology. So your right atrium specifically receives blood from both your superior and inferior vena cava as well as the coronary sinus. Your superior vena cava basically receives deoxygenated blood from the upper part of your chest and your head area, and then your inferior vena cava receives deoxygenated blood from the lower half of your body. The coronary sinus receives deoxygenated blood from the coronary circulation, which is the blood that feeds the heart itself. And then your left atrium receives blood from your pulmonary veins. This would be oxygenated blood coming back from your lungs. Now your ventricles, we said those were pumping chambers. We said that they're more muscular than the atria. They have to be stronger because they are pumping blood away from the heart, and it takes a little bit more force to do that. Your right ventricle sends blood to your lungs. This would be deoxygenated blood going to the lungs to pick up oxygenation. You'll be going through your pulmonary trunk to get to your pulmonary arteries and then to your lungs. And then when we bring the oxygenated blood back to your heart, it enters the right atrium, it goes down to, or excuse me, the left atrium, it goes down to the left ventricle. Your left ventricle will pump it out through your aorta, through your aortic semilunar valve, and then your aorta sends it out to the rest of your body. Just a picture of a real human heart. And so we've got over here, we've got your auricle of your right atrium, okay, your auricle of your left atrium. So if we had this line and say, you know, identify this chamber, it would have been your atrium. Identify the structure, it would have been your right auricle, okay. You can see your anterior interventricular sulcus, this small indentation where this blood vessel lies. You've got another one on your back, or the posterior aspect of your heart as well, things like that. Oh, here's the back side of the heart. So you've got your posterior interventricular sulcus. Again, it's just that indentation, okay? Blood vessels are going to sit in those indentations. Your coronary sinus is this really big vein on the back side of your heart. It sits in your coronary sulcus,